So till now, we have seen what is try catch, how do we handle exception using try catch, and we have seen that how we can throw exception using throw keyword. And as I said that the very common question asked is what is the difference between throw and throws. So let's just try to understand throws, and obviously that will make the difference between the two very clear. So now let's say you have written a method print, and whatever code you have written inside the print can cause an exception. So either this could be an exception thrown by the Java runtime system, or let's say here itself, exception is thrown by the code. Now we have two options, that either we handle the exception inside print method only, or we throw exception to the calling method, whosoever has called this print method. So in first case, what we'll do is we'll simply have try and catch here, and I'll handle the exception, which means it's fine. Now in second case, when we are throwing exception to the caller, and it would be great if you could just tell the caller this particular print method is going to throw or might throw IO exception, so why don't you just be ready to handle it. So I'm repeating, let me just write it down. So there could be a situation when a method can cause an exception which might not be handled by the might not be handled by the method, and we expect the caller or the calling method to handle the exception. In this case, we might want to inform the calling method about the exceptions that print might throw. So what is happening is, I am not handling IO exception here. I'm throwing it to the method which called print method, and that particular method should handle it. So I just want a way in which I can just list down the exceptions that print might throw. So whosoever calls print knows that okay, print might throw IO exception and I should be ready to handle it. So I simply need a way to list down the exceptions such that the method which is calling print knows that okay, this particular set of exceptions are going to be thrown or might be thrown and I should handle it. So this can be done using throws keyword. So in order to list down the exceptions that print might throw, we will have syntax something like this. We will have name of the function, we will have name of the method, keyword throws, and list of exceptions. So here we are just throwing one exception, so I'll just write down IO exception. In case there are more than one exception, we'll just put a comma and write down the list, or let's say there's one more null pointer exception, and I'll simply have the method body. Now here I want to tell you something, is that it is not necessary that this print will for sure throw these exceptions. It's just that the code inside the print might throw these kind of exceptions, hence we are putting this here. So we are just informing the methods who are calling print that okay, these are the exceptions that might be thrown, so make sure you take care of it. You either handle it or you rethrow it. So that is the use case of throws. In simple ways, throws is used to list down the exceptions that a particular method might throw. So if someone asks you the difference between throw and throws, a very striking difference is that throw is used to throw an exception on our own, and throws is used to list down the exceptions that a particular method can throw. Now let's just proceed further and see an example, and that particular example will take us to the discussion of checked and unchecked exception. Let's just proceed further and see that. So here, let's say I have main. I am creating a method print. Let's say this particular method print is throwing IO exception. So let's say I throw IO exception. Let me import it. Okay, so this IO exception is already imported. Now as you can see that you are getting a compilation error here. So what is happening here is that, let me see what is the error. The error is add throws declaration surround with try catch. So now what happens is that there are a kind of exception which are known as checked exception. So whenever you have a checked exception, whenever you have a method which might throw a checked exception, let me write it down here, checked exception, then either your code should handle it using try and catch, or it should have throws declaration just to inform the method who is calling print that this particular method will throw IO exception and make sure you are handling it. So hence we are getting this compilation error that either add try catch or add throws declaration. So let's say I go ahead and add throws declaration. So this is the use case of throws, as you can see. Now when I use throws here and I put IO exception here, and now let's say I call this particular method from main print. So now if you see here again, you are getting compilation error. So what is the error? Let's see again. So it says unhandled exception type IO exception. So now what's happening here is that print is throwing IO exception and this particular main method is not handling it. So you either have to handle it using try catch or using throws. So let me add just try catch here. So as you can see, now things are working fine. So we will discuss that why is this happening and what is checked exception, what is unchecked exception. Before that, I just want to show you another scenario. So let's say now we don't have IO exception, we have null pointer exception. So let me put in null pointer exception here. And let me remove this. Okay, so as you can see that in previous code, when we had IO exception here and we were not throwing it, or when we are not handling it, we were getting a compilation error. But here we are not getting any error, any compilation error. We are throwing null pointer exception and no one is handling it, and the compiler is fine with it. And let me tell you, this null pointer exception comes in the category of unchecked exception. So what is the major difference between checked exception and unchecked exception is that whenever your code is throwing any sort of checked exception, the compiler checks that whether you are handling it or not. If you are not handling it, then you get a compilation error. And obviously if you're handling it, it's fine. And you can do the handling either using try catch or throws. Whereas in case of unchecked exception, there is no such checking from the compiler. You handle it or not, obviously when you run it, you will get the exception, but during compilation, there is no such check. So this is a major difference between checked exception and unchecked exception. So let's just write it down again. Okay, so again, this is a very famous question, checked exception versus unchecked exception. So first, as we have already seen that checked exception is something whose handling is checked by the compiler, and it is necessary to handle checked exceptions using either try catch or throws, else you get compilation error. Whereas unchecked exception is something that is, or whose handling is not checked by the compiler. So now what comes under checked and unchecked exception? So all the exceptions that are not runtime exceptions comes under checked exception, and all the runtime exceptions like arithmetic exception, array index out of bound exception, these come under unchecked exception, and also errors come under unchecked exception. So these are unchecked exception. Now what comes under checked exceptions? All the exceptions that are subclass of exception class but are not runtime exceptions come under checked exception. Examples being IO exception, SQL exception, unknown host exception. So these are some kind of checked exception. Whenever you are writing a code and if your code might cause any of these exceptions or any of the checked exceptions, there are other checked exceptions as well, then it is necessary that you either handle it using try catch or using throws. So when you are using throws and throwing the exception, then whosoever is calling this particular method or the method you have written should again handle it. That particular method should either handle it using try catch or using throws. So this is necessary, else what will happen is that during compile time only it is checked that whether this particular exception is handled or not. If it is not, you get compilation error. Now you might be wondering that why is that compiler is bothered about these exceptions, handling of these exceptions, but not these exceptions. So if you see that in this particular case you have a runtime exception, arithmetic exception. So let's say arithmetic exception is occurring because you're doing something like a by b and the value of b is 0. So this is something that you should take care of when you're writing the code, that b should not have the value as 0. Rather than just throwing this as an exception, you should be extra careful when you're writing the code. But in this case, let's say you are using a resource. In case of IO exception, you're using a file, let's say, and some exception occurs. In that case, if you are not handling that particular exception, it might happen that the file remains open, or in any of these cases when you're using a resource, outside resource, if that particular resource still remains open or still remains in use, that obviously will lead to misuse of the resources, or it might happen that lots of resources remain open, which will eventually lead to several issues. So it is really necessary that if any exception occur in this particular case, you handle it and maybe you close the file or you close the resource or whatever it is. So it is really necessary that you handle it. In case of runtime exceptions, these are something that needs to be taken care of while you're writing the code, and you have to be extra careful while you're writing the code. So this is something that is actually handleable while you're writing the code. Hence, it is not necessary to handle unchecked exception, but it is really necessary to handle checked exception. Hence, compiler checks it during compile time only. So that is the difference between checked exception and unchecked exception. Next, we are going to talk about two more stuff. We are going to talk about how to create our own exceptions, and we will talk about something called keyword finally.